I'm going to meet with him. We're going to see what the parameters are. I'm then going to call up President Zelensky and the European leaders. Right after the meeting, yeah. And I'm going to tell them what kind of a deal. I'm not going to make a deal. It's not up to me to make a deal. I'd like to see a ceasefire. I'd like to see the best deal that could be made for both parties. You know, it takes two to tango, right?
That is President Trump in the Oval Office just minutes ago, right before we came on the air here, talking about what the deal is that he's not going to make. So the deal maker curiously sets up the standard by saying, I'm not going to make any kind of a deal. But then, as we're going to see in a minute, talks about the deal he's going to try to broker. We're trying to make sense of where all this is going, whether Trump has set himself up in a no-win situation from which really he may come out on the downside of this almost no matter how the negotiations do or don't go with Russia. And to try and make sense of all of this, especially from the European perspective, we have Alexander Mercouris back with us today, co-host of the Duran YouTube channel, and just an amazing human being. Well, welcome back to the show.
Delighted to be back again, and no better person to discuss this all with than you, if I could say, Daniel.
Well, listen, this is fascinating. I mean, on the one hand, I mean, you have this war raging, and everybody, at least most sane people, want it to be over with as soon as possible, at the least cost, especially to the Ukraine side. But it just kind of is a head scratcher and kind of an odd situation. And so you see Trump again just minutes ago saying, well, I'm not going to make a deal with anybody. I mean, that's not up to me to make a deal. And so the obvious question is, well, hang on. If you're not making a deal, what are you meeting with President Putin for? I mean, what do you make of that comment right off the bat?
Well, absolutely, because one of the problems is that obviously the United States and Russia have a lot to talk about with each other. They're both major powers. The United States is a superpower. Russia was a superpower. Maybe it will become one again. It's a major nuclear power. It's got huge influence and a role in the Middle East, in Europe, in all sorts of places. They could have economic links. They could do all kinds of things. So they do have things that they can talk about with each other. But the United States, Donald Trump himself, has made any further positive progress on all of those other things contingent on success in coming to a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. So he wants a better relationship with Russia. He said this many times. And at the same time, he's letting himself get tied down constantly by saying, well, it's got to be sorted out by Russia and Ukraine, except of course that means that he's excluding himself from involvement in the discussion. So if he's not going to push towards a peace in Ukraine, what is he meeting Putin for, since he himself says, I can't move on many of these other things until I have that peace?
And of course, he says all the time, you know, I am the deal maker. I'm the indispensable person here. I've ended 6 wars, he claims, most recently including the Armenian-Azerbaijan war, which weirdly, we could probably talk about this another time. They actually gave him credit for that too. So that's not without substance on that one anyway. But he kind of views himself as the deal maker and the negotiator that's getting all of these things done, which he on his website or on his True Social post said, I'm the only guy that could have got that done. So now here he goes coming into Alaska with President Putin to make this happen. Now, I just showed you a soundbite from minutes ago where he said it's not my deal to make, but then in subsequent question seemed to imply that he is working a deal.
I was a little bothered by the fact that Zelensky was saying, well, I have to get constitutional approval. I mean, he's got approval to go into war and kill everybody, but he needs approval to do a land swap because there'll be some land swapping going on. I know that through Russia and through conversations with everybody to the good, for the good of Ukraine. Good stuff, not bad stuff. Also, some bad stuff for both. So there's good and there's bad. But it's very complex because you have lines that are very uneven, and there'll be some swapping, there'll be some changes in land, and the word that they will use is, they make changes. We're going to change the lines, the battle lines. Russia's occupied a big portion of Ukraine. They've occupied some very prime territory. We're going to try and get some of that territory back for Ukraine.
So it's not up to me, but it is up to me, and we're going to get some land swapped. What do you make of his comments there about I've talked to Russia and I've talked to other people? So he kind of implies there that other people can only mean either Ukraine or Europe are behind this. Is that the case?
Well, no, they're not. I mean, the Ukrainians have said that they're not interested in land swaps. And you can understand what Zelensky is talking about, because if he starts agreeing to land swaps with the Russians, then he's made a very big step towards recognizing that the Russians do actually have legitimate control of whatever territory they retain in Ukraine. Now, Trump doesn't want to acknowledge this. And in fact, he's resisting it, and he's resisting it in these comments. But that's the problem he has. He wants them to do something. He won't agree it himself. He says, "Look, this is what I'm suggesting, and you should just go ahead and do it. And it's all in your interests. And maybe you don't like it, but it's for your good in the end." But he's not taking any responsibility for it either. He's throwing it all to them. And of course, the Ukrainians, as he's basically admitting, have already rejected outright any proposal, any of the kind of proposal that he's floating there. So you may think he's the great deal maker, but it looks as if the Ukrainians, for the moment at least, don't want to take the deal.
Yeah, and certainly we're going to find out whether that continues to be the case. But it seems to me, though, I have this operating theory, and I'd like your views on this, and we'll take it piece by piece. But the general theory is this, that Trump has put himself in a no-win situation. If he agrees to whatever he's going to agree to with Putin, whether he, quote, makes a deal or just, quote, agrees with him, that's a terminology issue. But if he comes out of that meeting and says, okay, I've agreed that Putin is right, we should swap land A for land B. We can talk about what those swaps may actually entail. But he actually says, yeah, we'll swap that, meaning that Ukraine is going to have to give up some territory that currently it possesses, especially in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and possibly even in Zaporizhia and Kherson. So now then he agrees to that, but then it goes back, and then Zelensky doesn't agree to it, and he says, no, I'm not going to do it. So then Trump comes off looking like he can't get either Zelensky or Europe to agree to, because they certainly are at least on record so far as to saying no, they're opposed to that. So in that scenario, Trump comes off looking like he's powerless to get our own side on the same sheet of music, and he's agreed to something with Putin that now he can't deliver. If instead he goes there and Putin wants more than what he's willing to agree to, and he leaves with nothing, now then Trump looks like he can't do anything with Ukraine or Europe or Putin, and he comes off looking weaker. So we're just going to stick with those two first. How do you see that first scenario where Trump agrees to something and then he can't get Ukraine and Europe on board?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, if he can't get the Ukrainians and the Europeans to agree, and the whole thing falls apart, then he's going to find himself facing two things. Firstly, he will look weak and ineffective because he's come up with a deal which the Ukrainians have vetoed. And unless he's prepared to put far more pressure on Ukraine that he's been prepared to put on up till now, and is prepared to engage the Ukrainians in a massive public row in which the Ukrainians will have the Europeans on their side, then, as I said, unless he's prepared to do that, he will look weak. At the same time, he's inevitably going to be criticized. And there's already criticisms appearing in Europe. They're saying it's Yalta and Potsdam all over again, that Trump is bargaining away Ukraine's land without consulting Ukraine, that this is the United States and Russia carving up Ukraine between them and behaving in a dismissive and contemptuous way of Ukraine. So he's going to be criticized for doing that, perhaps unjustly, by the way, because of course none of that addresses the realities of Ukraine's current position. But I mean, he's going to be accused of that, even as he might also find that he's going to be criticized. Oh, he's going to be criticized by the Russians and by others for being weak because he can't make this deal stick. So it could look rather ugly, actually. He will look both weak to the Russians and to the Ukrainians ultimately, and at the same time, he will be criticized for attempting to bargain with Putin and Ukrainian land away.
And I'm just going to kind of like a sequel off of that. If he agrees to that, and then it's the Europeans are not able to make that happen, then you have an additional situation to where now then Trump has got to say, which land are we going to give away, and how is that going to be negotiated to get, et cetera. And so I don't think he even has a concept of how that might happen, because how is he going to make Ukraine voluntarily withdraw from some of that territory?
It's an excellent question. Now, the word that I've seen in London, and it's attributed to a US official, but you must take all this very carefully, is that the idea is that the Russians take over the whole of Donbass and Ukraine regains territory that is lost in Kharkiv, Sumy region, Chernigov, Dnipropetrovsk, and hands over to the Russians the remaining territory in the four regions, Kherson and Zaporozhye. Now, I don't know whether that really is remotely workable, and I cannot imagine the Ukrainians agreeing to anything like that. I mean, they would be giving up relatively small and unimportant territories. I mean, unimportant in an economic sense, for two major cities, Zaporozhye and Kherson. So if that is the plan, I can't see them agreeing to it. And I'm not sure I can see them agreeing to land swaps at all, for the reasons that I said already, that, it will legitimize Russian control. And besides, I agree with you. I'm not sure that Trump himself really knows what land he's going to be swapped for which land. And of course, he says that this is for the Ukrainians and the Russians to work out between them. But what if the Ukrainians flatly say, no, we're not going to do this at all? This is not in our interests. This isn't what we're going to do. As I said, he's looking foolish and he's looking weak. And it's also, he's going to be open to criticism of all sorts of kinds.
And in fact, let's give you another round of criticism going down that path here, is that in the event that scenario transpires that you just talked about, where Trump agrees to the territory that you just mentioned there about Zaporizhia and Kherson, et cetera, and the Ukraine side says we're just flatly not going to do it, and European Union says no, we're not going to support that either. In fact, we're going to double down on giving Ukraine more arms and more weapons and more diplomatic cover, et cetera. So then Trump is faced with, not only are you looking weak, but you have to then face as Trump to say, okay, fine, then I'm going to walk away. I'm not going to do anything. You guys have at it. If you don't want to work this deal, that's up to you. Well, that may play well on the day the statement's made, but then that is fundamentally going to mean, and it will certainly be characterized this way, that many will say, well, Trump, you literally just helped Vladimir Putin. You abandoned the Ukraine, you gave away all this stuff, and now that you've helped Russia by weakening Ukraine further, and then if Russia goes ahead and does that and conquers the territory, I mean, that's a new level of problem for Trump, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly what people are going to say. I mean, they're going to say that in Alaska, Trump sided with Putin against Ukraine. And if Ukraine is defeated on the battlefields and loses all these territories, they will say, well, it was actually Trump, basically, who set up the whole situation, which brought that about. I mean, this is not going to look good at all. So if you can't get a deal, if this all falls apart, if he floats proposals like this and they're not accepted, but the war goes on and Ukraine is defeated, then with those kind of outcomes, then inevitably and unavoidably he's going to be blamed.
Okay, now let's look at scenario 2, where as Trump goes there and Putin asks for more. I mean, let's say that he talks about, there has to be demilitarization and denazification, which they have been saying really from the beginning that has to be part of the deal. And then Trump can't agree to that. So he said, you don't just want territory, you also want political outcomes that we're not going to be able to follow. And so Trump leaves without any kind of deal at all. Now then he comes across looking like he can't get a deal with anybody. How does that work out?
Well, that's entirely right. Now, I ought to say that the Russians have been repeatedly saying that for them it is not a conflict about territory. It is a conflict about security. I mean, Lavrov says this all the time, for example. Putin has said it too. So, I mean, demilitarization, denuclearization, neutral status for Ukraine, the extinguishing of the nationalist movement in Ukraine, all of that. The Russians have repeatedly said that these are for them absolute objectives and goals and conditions, and that they won't be satisfied until all of that happens. And unless there has been some massive change in the Russian position, of which, to be clear, I have seen no sign, certainly not now. I am sure that is what they're going to say to Trump when they meet him in Alaska, what Putin is going to say to Trump when he meets him in Alaska. Now, of course, Trump might come back and say, well, these are things for you to sort out with the Ukrainians. But then Putin will say, well, what if we can't sort them out with the Ukrainians? If the Ukrainians flatly refuse to negotiate with us about any of these things, what then? Do we continue the war? He will probably say we need at least some commitment from the Ukrainians to move towards us on these things. In his speech, which he made on the 14th of June, 2024, the one where he set out the basic conditions, and which only a week ago Putin was saying, still sets out our goal. He said, look, we can have a ceasefire if the Ukrainians withdraw from the 4 regions and commit to not joining NATO. So you see, even people forget that he brought up the topic of NATO when he talked about the Ukrainians withdrawing from the 4 regions. So what if the Ukrainians won't commit to not joining NATO, won't say that they're not going to join NATO? What if they continue to insist on joining their right to join NATO and security guarantees and all of that? As I said, unless there's been a dramatic change in the Russian position, then, as I said, I can't imagine that Putin won't bring these points up when he meets Trump. And I don't know what Trump is going to say in response.
Well, I think that what might be the one sliver of possibility where Trump could escape this without being harmed and will result in kicking the can down the road, which apparently, at least some comments from the Russian side, is in the realm of possibility, and that is to come away with an air ceasefire, just a temporary air ceasefire. No drone and missile attacks on each other's energy infrastructure, which Ukraine has been having a little bit more success in their air attacks against Russia. Russia obviously continues to have significant attacks against Ukraine. It's been successful, though it has been reducing in intensity here in the last few days, interestingly enough. But that's the one area where Russia might actually benefit from, of having it so their infrastructure doesn't get hit anymore. And that can just kind of kick the can down the road, but at least will avoid any near-term disaster for Trump. How do you see that?
Well, it's possible. We know about this proposal because it was mentioned at that very same meeting where Putin said, that we haven't shifted from our objectives, which are the ones I set out on the 14th of June, 2024. At that meeting, when Putin was there and said that, the other person who was there was the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. Belarus is a former republic of the Soviet Union, very closely allied to Russia, and Lukashenko is now basically a friend of Putin's. And Lukashenko actually floated the possibility of this truce in the air. And interestingly, he said that it was the Americans, he didn't say which Americans, that the Americans who had proposed it. And he said, look, this might be something the Russians might be interested in. Why don't you approach them about it? So it could be something that Putin might concede at this meeting on Friday. I think Putin will not, by the way, and I think this is the other thing I would say. I think Putin will not want to slam the door in Trump's face. I mean, he's consistently avoided doing that throughout the various interactions that they've had. I mean, Trump has said some pretty strong things about Putin. Putin has never reciprocated And I think Putin wants a long-term relationship with Trump. And he might say to himself, well, look, a truce in the air does actually take some of the pressure of us because the Ukrainians are hitting our infrastructure, but it also concedes something to Trump that he can take away from this meeting, and at the same time doesn't put our position and in any particular danger. So I think, it's possible.
Well, we're certainly going to see. We don't have to wait too many more days, but
No.
until that time, the European Union is going to do everything they can to put the real screws down on Trump and try to talk him out of doing any of the things that they don't like. More on that in a second. But first of all, let's look at the most important other actor here, and that's the one that apparently won't be in Alaska, and that is Volodymyr Zelensky.
Of course, our team is working with the United States. Not a single day goes by without communication on how to ensure real peace. We understand Russia's intention to try to deceive America. We will not allow this. I greatly value the determination with which President Trump is committed to bringing an end to the killings in this war. Every day, many people are giving their lives. But the sole root cause of these killings is Putin's desire to wage war and manipulate everyone he comes into contact with.
So you see, he's trying to simultaneously keep Trump on his side by saying, I really value what he's going on here. But then he says, but Trump is being deceived, and I won't allow that. What do you think he means, and what can he do to not allow that?
Well, what he wanted was to be invited to Alaska. And I think one of the things that has probably annoyed Zelensky is the fact that he's now not going to get an invitation to Alaska. At least that's one thing that Trump made clear over the course of those comments that we just heard, that, he's going to speak to Zelensky afterwards, but Zelensky's not going to be participating in this meeting. But in all other respects, what Zelensky wants to do, I think, is to stop any real dialogue between Putin and Trump. I mean, he's not really happy about this discussion at all, because for Zelensky, any conversation between Putin and Trump, any dialogue between the United States and Russia, he sees as dangerous to himself. He does not want the Americans and the Russians coming together and reaching an agreement. So when he talks about the Russians being there to deceive Trump and all of that, and not Trump being, I suppose, a naive man who needs it all to be explained to him by Zelensky, well, you can see exactly what it is that Zelensky's trying to do. He's trying to tell Trump, don't listen to the Russians, listen to me. I'm the person who knows. Don't pay any attention to what this man Putin is saying. I'm the person who you should be speaking to, not to Putin at all.
And, I think that continues on a trend that we've seen in the West for quite some time, that a number of leaders have a lot of misplaced confidence in their ability to influence other people and other leaders. Trump has it a lot. Zelensky seems to suffer from it. And so does actually the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, who seems to try to be trying to placate everybody, to trying to lather up Trump with all kinds of praise, while at the same time trying to send some not so subtle messages that Trump needs to listen to him. Here is Rutte over the weekend talking like he's in the dominant position, looking down on Putin.
He clearly is putting pressure on Putin. Next Friday will be important because it will be about testing Putin, how serious he is on bringing this terrible war to an end.
So this is about Donald Trump coming down and I'm going to test you, little Putin. I mean, how do you read that?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's what Rutte wants Trump to do. And that's in effect what he's telling Trump to do. He's saying, this is your chance. This is what you should be doing. You should go into this meeting. You should bang the table. You should tell Putin, Vladimir, this has gone too far. You must stop now. If you don't stop, I'm going to do X, Y, Z to make sure that, you really feel the pressure coming from me. So you're absolutely correct. This isn't Trump's, what Trump is saying. It's what Mark Rutte is saying. Flattery, but also a very, very high degree of direction and manipulation as well. I mean, both Zelensky and Rutte are being very manipulative in these comments altogether. Now, Zelensky has been manipulative at many points in this war. It's rather sad to see the Secretary of General of NATO and a former Dutch Prime Minister behave in the same way. Just saying.
It is, and so that was the one comment there about we have to test Putin, like Putin has to prove something to the West in order to get some kind of a deal. But then he went further and started really revealing what the European side, where they're all about here. This is what they're trying to accomplish.
When it comes to full-scale negotiations, and let's hope that Friday will be an important step in that process. We need Ukraine at the table. It will be about territory. It will be, of course, about security guarantees, but also about the absolute need to acknowledge that Ukraine decides on its own future, that Ukraine has to be a sovereign nation, deciding on its own geopolitical future, of course, having no limitations to its own military troop levels, and for NATO to have no limitations on our presence on the eastern flank in countries like Latvia, Estonia, and Finland.
So you mentioned a second ago that he's trying to put some limitations on Trump or whatever, but now he's trying to say that there won't be any limitations on the Ukraine side. So they get to have security guarantees. So completely ignoring everything that Russia said on that June 14, 2024 meeting that you mentioned, that Putin has reminded us several times that is still on the table, and they're continued. There will not be demilitarization. There will not be territory swapped, and that NATO is still at play. So how is that going to play into all this? Because if you're in the dominant position, you can make those statements. But I don't think we're in the dominant position. Therefore, what does that mean?
Well, this is exactly. I mean, we'll come to that, no doubt. But your point about we're not in a dominant position. I mean, we would be able to make those demands of the Russians if we were willing. When we are losing, I say we are losing. The Ukrainians are losing. It's a very strange thing to make demands at this time like that. The Russians, of course, will be hearing all of this. They will be hearing what Mark Rutte is saying. And what Mark Rutte is saying is exactly the same as what Friedrich Merz and Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron and all of the other leaders of Europe are saying. And the Russians will be saying to themselves, well, absolutely, we've got to be incredibly careful here, because these people have not accepted in any way that the situation, the causes of the war, the root causes of the war were what we are saying: eastward expansion of NATO, the movement of NATO towards our borders, all of those things. They continue to be an enormous threat to us. Obviously, we cannot accept these proposals. If these are the only proposals the Ukrainians and the Europeans are going to make to us, then we might as well continue the war, because these proposals are so completely unacceptable that we can't possibly entertain them.
It's interesting. So you have Mark Rutte saying that, and obviously that's been coordinated with all the major European leaders, like you just mentioned here. It's also worth noting that over the weekend, you had the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who had already been scheduled to be in London and had a number of conversations with all of these people, was involved with some of these meetings. And so you see what the Europeans said coming out of that. Now here's what J.D. Vance said on U.S. television this weekend, which is a little different.
I think the president, and I certainly think that America, we're done with the funding of the Ukraine war business. We want to bring about a peaceful settlement to this thing. We want to stop the killing. But Americans, I think, are sick of continuing to send their money, their tax dollars to this particular conflict. But if the Europeans want to step up and actually buy the weapons from American producers, we're okay with that, but we're not going to fund it ourselves anymore.
So, well, I mean, that sounds like a pretty solid shot across the bow, not to Putin, but back across Europe. What do you make of it?
Well, the first thing to say is I've heard an awful lot about the European response to J.D. Vance, and apparently they are quite impressed by him. So I just want to say that in advance. Apparently he's made quite an impression. But you're absolutely right. I mean, here we see Mark Rutte, and by the way, Zelensky, trying to draw lines for the United States. The United States, at least J.D. Vance, is trying to do the same for the Europeans. He's saying, look, if you really want to go on with this war, if you want to ignore everything that we're trying to do to bring it to an end, if you're really going to continue to make impossible demands and refuse to make concessions, the kind of concessions that need to be made in order to achieve peace, well, that's up to you. But, at that point, you're on your own, because we have invested all this money in this. We have done all that we can to bring this war to an end. We are not going to be involved any further. So it's both a warning in some ways, and I think, and actually an indicator of where at least some people in the United States want the United States to go. They're saying, look, this has turned out wrong. It's turned out wrong for Ukraine. It's turned out wrong for the United States. We can't continue to invest in failure.
Now you'd mentioned that J.D. Vance had been viewed positively. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're hearing about how those interactions are taking place?
I'm not. Well, positive is perhaps maybe a bit too strong. They are impressed by him. They found him somebody who listens very carefully to what people say, who understands what people are saying. And I don't just mean understands the surface words, that he understands what's going on under the surface, what people are trying to say, and that he knows exactly how to respond in ways that, on the one hand, don't create an immediate rupture, but at the same time don't compromise the future flexibility of the United States. I think people have been very impressed by J.D. Vance. That's what I've been hearing.
That's actually good to hear. I was not aware. I'd been wondering how those went, because the conversation or the comments coming out of the two sides were rather different. But J.D. Vance isn't the decision maker. No. He's only the vice president who's carrying forward the message of his boss.
Yes.
But in terms of Trump's friends, Lindsey Graham is obviously he's a U.S. senator, so he didn't have any power himself, but he's a good golfing buddy of President Trump. And over the weekend, he had this to say. Yeah, that's the one right there. That by the way is just behind my house. I can almost see that site from where I live, which is interesting. But over the weekend, Senator Graham went on, who by the way, about a few weeks ago was just really enthusiastic, full-throated about throwing massive tariffs and sanctions on Russia and on secondary sanctions on China, India, and Brazil. Now here's what he's saying yesterday.
Do you believe that Ukraine should sign a deal that includes giving up any part of their territory, Senator?
Well, think about East Berlin and West Berlin as a way a conflict can be settled, at least for a period of time. North Korea and South Korea is in a state of truce. There's never been a final settlement. But I come on your show a good bit. I want to be honest with you. Ukraine's not going to evict every Russian, and Russia's not going to Kyiv. So there'll be some land swaps at the end.
So let's just focus on two parts of the thing you said there. You said that Ukraine's not going to be able to eject Russia, and Russia's not going to Kiev. Let's look at the first part of that first, that Ukraine's not going to be able to eject Russia. So if that's the case, then why were you so enthusiastic about all these massive sanctions and tariffs a few weeks ago? And now you're going, yeah, but they're going to have to give up stuff anyway. What does people in Europe make of that seeming switch?
Well, that's a very good question, because, of course, Lindsey Graham is more than just a U.S. senator. I mean, he admitted in the same interview that he has spent the last couple of days on the phone talking to European leaders and to the Ukrainians. Now, I'm not familiar with the constitutional realities of the United States, but I would have thought that was something that the United States government, the executive, headed by the president, does. And here we see a senator, and he appears to be participating in some form in the negotiations and in all the discussions that are taking place. So this is somebody who is very, very, very deeply involved and enmeshed in all the things that are taking place at the moment. Now, why has he changed his tune in the way that he has? Because he absolutely has done. I mean, he's talking about, previously he's been one of the most hardline figures in Washington throughout the war. He supported every single offensive that the Ukrainians launched. He's been a supporter of sanctions. He supported everything. And he's got this enormous bill for bone-crushing sanctions and all of the rest. I suspect what has happened, and I suspect also a major reason for this summit, is that the people in the Commerce Department and the Treasury Department have come along and have said, Mr. President, Mr. Senator, this isn't going to work. The Indians are still buying Russian oil. The Chinese will continue to buy Russian oil. The BRIC states are coming together. They're not fragmenting. We are having problems accessing rare earths from China. This is becoming a major industrial problem as well. And ultimately, this idea that we had that we can somehow use sanctions and tariffs to first isolate the Russians and then force them into these kind of concessions and bring the war to an end on that basis, with the Russians pulling out of Ukraine entirely. I think even Lindsey Graham, as he showed in this program, now finally understands that that isn't going to happen. So it's very interesting to see Lindsey Graham speak in that way. It's very different from how he used to speak just 1 or 2 weeks ago, exactly as you said.
One related question, a bit of a diversion off. One of the things Trump said in his original 10-day deadline that was supposed to have expired last Friday, that he said he was going to bring all of Lindsey Graham's sanctions and tariffs, et cetera, to bear. He didn't do any of that, except that 2 days before that, he did announce 25% tariffs on India alone because they were buying Russian oil, et cetera. That's not supposed to happen until, I guess, about 2.5 more weeks from now, if it happens at all. But what do you make about Trump selecting India, of all people, to be the one target, the sole target of that, even before the 10 days expired?
Well, this takes us back to the flaw in this whole idea, because India was targeted for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it buys a lot of Russian oil, which it does, and it has very strong historic links with Russia. But secondly, because it was assessed, I think, in Washington, that if India was singled out in this way, because India does not run a huge trade surplus with the United States and isn't an enormously important trade partner for the United States, that India would not be able to respond, and that maybe India might buckle, that they might agree to stop buying the Russian oil. Now, it's not played out that way. Because though India may not be a critically important economic partner in the way that China is, India has been a good friend over the last 15 or so years, basically going back to George W. Bush's time, of the United States. They've had good relations with the United States. They're members of the Quad. They've conducted military exercises with the United States. They've been talking about buying US military equipment. And I think that what happened was that the Indians were singled out because at one level they were seen as important because they buy so much Russian oil. And secondly, they weren't seen as dangerous. But now it's become clear that by sanctioning them in the way that was done, the United States is risking its long-term relationship with India, which is so important to the United States in the duel the United States is involved in with China. And already we're getting reports that the Indians are now slow walking ideas of buying American weapons. There's reports that the Indians are taking other countermeasures, mostly diplomatic countermeasures, that they're distancing themselves from the United States. Modi is inviting Putin to India at the end of this month, and he's going to also go to China very soon to attend in person the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, instead of sending his foreign minister as has been previously anticipated.
And we'll see if, when the 21 days expires, if Trump doesn't somehow change the tariffs and doesn't apply them. I think pretty likely that's going to happen given his history.
Exactly.
All right, so we've looked at what Trump has said. We've looked a little bit at what the Russians have said, and certainly Europeans and American statesmen. But now then, all of this diplomatic talk has to happen in context of what's happening on the ground. I think too few people want to separate that out. It's like, okay, well, there's a conflict going on. It's been going on for 3.5 years, so it's just kind of in the background now. What really matters is what's going on diplomatically. But I think that people might want to relook that, because there have been acceleration in the Russian advances and an acceleration in the deterioration of the Ukraine side in recent weeks. And even in the last 24 hours, there's been one really major change on the front line that I want to talk about today. I'm going to show you parts of two different military mappers. One's a neutral mapper and one is a pro-Ukraine mapper, but they're talking about what's actually happening on the ground, and there is some alarm here. First of all, here is Preston Stewart talking about a big breakthrough north of Pokrovsk.
I want you to watch this area here, north of Verdinsky. While most of the concern was that they might try to move around west or even south and cut off Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk, it looks like, at least according to the deep state map, Russia may have made a bit of a sprint further north. So just shifting day by day, we saw a pretty expected movement, and then all of a sudden, a pretty big jump. In fact, if we look at the ruler here, just to give you an idea, and that's the gray zone it's marking, but that's 11 kilometers that went from controlled by Ukraine to at least gray zone, contested territory, and this stretch right here, at least the limit of Russian forces, 5 kilometers in the span of a day. We don't see that anywhere else along the front. You don't see that movement. We haven't for a long time.
Now, that I'm going to put even that in context. Here is a pro-Ukrainian mapper talking about why he is really worried about that move.
Also moved from this lake, I would say, almost close to Kolodzy, roughly 10 kilometers, just a little bit more, maybe a little less, but it's the huge jump. It means that the local defense here in this region before the main defense line is not that strong. So this is the Russian assault. You may see the expansion of the gray zone. Still, yeah, it's a gray zone with a little expansion of the red one, but it went for the far distance. And here is the main Ukrainian defense line. You may see it. Amber color. So for now, Russia sends some of the sabotage groups. They create actually the expansion of the gray zone, and later on Russia sends more reinforcements. So the previous defense line, you may see it over here, it already has been penetrated by the Russian army, but it wasn't that significant as the next one. So here we have this map. The Russian attack vector is over here. The idea for them is to penetrate the Ukrainian defense line and go behind the front lines, encircling Ukrainian group in Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, at the same time simultaneously attacking from all of the sides. All of those pockets pushing also here. By the way, Russia had the territorial gains there recently. So it's much bigger operation which Putin planned actually for this summer campaign. That's why there was the information that Putin promised to Donald Trump to occupy Donbass quite soon.
So you see there that's an important part of the front. In fact, we've had a Russian journalist who's a former Russian soldier said that and told us a little over a month ago that the Pokrovsk area was the main effort for the Russians. They had supporting efforts in the south in Kherson and in the north in Kupiansk, which they're making also progress there. But as you see on the map here, I mean, first of all, in Pokrovsk itself, Russia is now inside the city. I mean, almost into the heart of the city. Meanwhile, up in the Rodinska area, they have now moved beyond the city, all up in the north here. And you see all of this new. This is just in the last 48 hours, a huge expansion of Russian there. And then you zoom out and you can see back into how this fits in the whole battlefront there. And you just saw that the main defensive line for Ukraine runs around this area here. And if Russia penetrates that, then all of this other stuff can actually be put into an operational encirclement on a huge scale, bigger than anything we've seen in the whole war. And beyond that, Alexander, there's nothing but farmland up here. If Russia can break through here, and according to many reports, there are still upwards of 100,000 Russian soldiers not in contact, along the line of contact, in the areas variously stationed throughout here. In the event that there is a breakthrough, they have exploitation forces. It really is starting to look like the Ukraine side is starting to suffer a real deterioration in their defensive capability. We've been talking, I think you and I, several times, and ultimately it's the fabric of the Ukraine army, which is the target of the Russian attacks, not so much territory, but if they get that, then all of a sudden the front could literally collapse. And I don't think there's enough recognition in the West that that's actually a risk.
That is exactly right. And that is, by the way, what I'm hearing from people, both in Russia, and I have some contacts in Ukraine now, by the way, as well, which I didn't earlier. I mean, that they've actually started to appear over the course of this year, actually. And people there are indeed very concerned and very demoralized about the military situation. And to understand what is going on, I mean, I think you've explained the tactical situation extremely well, and I'm not going to repeat all the things that you said, but there's been a very interesting article that appeared yesterday in Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, their website, not a website that is in any way conceivably pro-Russian, just to make that, I mean, that's obvious, but just to repeat it. Anyway, what they are saying is that the Ukrainian army is now facing a massive crisis of infantry, that they don't have enough men, that in some parts of the front lines, there's only 12 men holding, I can't remember how many kilometers, but large distances, that the Russians are able, therefore, to penetrate and infiltrate through these lines and to destabilize the entire front line that's created in that sort of way. And I suspect that the reason why we have seen this incredibly rapid advance, which is all over the Russian and Ukrainian internet, by the way, the reason why we've seen it happen, not just over the last 24 hours, because this has been building up to this point for some days now, is that Ukraine just doesn't have enough men to hold all the positions that it needs to hold in order to prevent things like that taking place. In fact, you're getting reports that the Russians advance, they come up against fortified lines, trenches and bunkers and things like that, and they find that there are no Ukrainian soldiers there because there just aren't enough Ukrainians to hold the lines. So that is the reality that Ukraine is facing in the war. It's the Russian army is getting bigger, it's getting stronger, it has no problems recruiting soldiers. Everybody accepts this. Levels of professional training within the Russian military have improved apparently radically since what they were at the start of the war, when there were many, many problems within the Russian military. But they've gradually been kept, over time, they've gradually been sorted. Whereas the Ukrainian army, which, to be clear, is a very brave army. I mean, they've resisted very courageously. This is the article in Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, which I was referring to. This very brave army, it's gradually shrinking. The personnel who are replacing the people who are dead or wounded or otherwise unable to fight anymore are not as good as the people that were there before. They are in many cases much older, and there are not enough of them anyway. So this is the reality of the war. I think, like you, from what I've been hearing, people in Russia and Ukraine say, we are coming close to a collapse, at least in Donbass and potentially in eastern Ukraine as well.
So in the last amount of time we have here, let's shift our focus to the Russian side. We've talked a lot about the Western Europeans, Ukraine, and the United States. But given that reality, what do you think what do you expect that Vladimir Putin to do in this coming up meeting here, and just the Russian side diplomatically, let's just say over the next 30 days?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's important. I mean, this is obviously a point many making, but I mean, it's important to repeat it, that for Putin getting an invitation to come to the United States. Alaska's part of the United States, obviously, and to meet the President of the United States is a good thing. I mean, he's been, blockaded out of all discussions. The Americans weren't speaking to him. The Europeans weren't speaking to him. Now, the very fact that he's been invited to the United States, the optics in itself are important, but it also shows that the events on the ground are heading his direction. And he knows that, and that'll put him in a confident mood. I think he will want to maintain a dialogue with Donald Trump. I think he sees Donald Trump as the best president he is likely to get, at least for the time being, who might come to some kind of long-term security agreement with Russia about the situation in Europe. So he will want to maintain a good relationship with the United States and with Donald Trump. He wants long-term a relationship with the United States because he sees that as being in Russia's interests, for economic reasons, for security reasons. He doesn't want to be over-dependent on China. Not that I think he has any intention of breaking with China, but, it's always better to have more than one big friend. So he wants a relationship with the United States. He will come, therefore, with the intention in Alaska of maintaining a dialogue with Trump, President Trump, and he will look to find ways to help Trump on his side move forward with that relationship. And that might involve some concessions on some issues, but he is not in a position, and nor, I think, does he have the desire to negotiate away the fundamentals. He is not going to.
You tell me if you're the only thing that I can see that Putin has that he would quote give away is Sumy, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk. How do you see it?
Absolutely. I mean, he's not claimed those as part of Russian territory. He's up to now never said that they would become Russian territory. The Russians have been giving warnings about this. I think I said to you some programs ago that we did together that the Russian Defense Ministry has suddenly started referring to places in Kharkiv region that it is capturing as being liberated rather than captured. So that was an important change. And Putin has said, well, whatever territory we take in Ukraine is ours because, that is our historic national territory. But these are puffs, if you like. They are not yet policy. So he can give away Sumy, Kharkiv, places in Dnipropetrovsk region. It would not be difficult for him to do. It would not be controversial in Russia. And he might do that. I mean, as part of the deal, we're talking about land swaps. I can imagine that he would be prepared to do that. But
now, I'm sorry. In the last few minutes, I want to get one more in here before I have to go. What do you think is the ramifications, is a better way to put this, in the event that Putin and Trump don't come to a deal? They don't get any land swap because the Ukraine and the European side don't agree to it. They say, we'll fight on by ourselves if we want. And then Putin has said, okay, you leave me no choice. Now the only way we can secure our national interest is to continue fighting. And then he goes all the way to the Dnipro River, maybe takes Odessa, Kharkiv, etc., over some extended period of time. How will that play in the West? Because if Putin doesn't get the deal that you talked about there, where he has some limited ability to give away those so-called swap those territories that you just mentioned that are not part of the Donbass and the four territories. But if he moves on to take those, and do you think, first of all, he can? And second of all, what impact would that have on Europe?
Well, the answer is he can do it. Absolutely, he can do it. I mean, we've just heard what those two mappers said, and I have no reason to doubt that. And of course, you provided your own analysis, which I absolutely accept. And it's exactly the same analysis with some additions that you've given, but it's essentially the same analysis that I've heard from people in Russia and Ukraine as well. what would be the result of that for Europe? It would be a geopolitical disaster for us in Europe if that were to happen. The United States is all right. It's far away. It's got the ocean between us. So, the United States it'll come through. But for us in Europe, it would be a disaster. And this is why I do not understand why we are taking the stance that we are. The Americans are trying to help us. They're trying to avoid a situation where Ukraine is essentially either neutralized or even destroyed, and where Europe faces this catastrophe that we would be looking to, a catastrophe where we have the powerful, angry, rearmed Russia on our borders. It would be Cold War II all over again, but with a certain level of popular animus on the part of the Russians that we've never had before in the first Cold War. You would have thought that Western statesmen in Europe would be supporting President Trump in trying to find a way out. I am deeply depressed. I cannot find words to describe how upset I am by the fact that our leaders in Europe don't seem to understand this. And we get this extraordinarily manipulative language instead that we heard from Mark Rutte, which is the same language as you get from right across Europe. What do we think that we are doing? I simply don't understand it.
Well, I certainly don't either, and I'm certainly with you on that. And I guess we'll just have to hope that somehow some kind of a deal can be done, and even if kicking and screaming, Ukraine and Europe can be brought into some sort of, I don't even know if concessions is the right word. Just recognition of reality maybe would be a better point. If they can get some behind the scenes reports from their classified systems that, look, if you keep going, there could be a literal physical collapse of the Eastern Front, and then everything could fall apart. So taking that action now while you still have some ability to control, that would make sense. Let's hope that happens, because that is the one path that I think we could avoid a calamity, because otherwise it can get a lot worse.
Absolutely.
Well, in any case, thank you so much for coming on today. Always a pleasure to have you on there, and these great insights that you have, and the views, especially the context you have that we don't have to on the other side. So thank you very much for sharing that today.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much.
And we thank you guys for joining us today. As always, be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't. And to let you know, we are on Apple Podcasts. Be sure and let your friends know. I know a lot of folks really enjoy just audio podcasts, and we're on there too. I want to make sure you let your friends know. Spotify, Podcast Addict, anywhere you find that, just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and they'll find us there. Also, we're on Substack now, DanielDavisDeepDive.substack.com. As you see on the screen right there, because I know other people really enjoy getting their information on the printed medium. So we're providing that as well. So let everybody know, because you don't keep all this good information yourself. I'm telling you, you're getting analysis here, genuine, straight up truth that looks at all of the factors here. You just don't get this anywhere else. Don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your friends. Thanks very much, folks. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.